Daniel Carter sat quietly on the gray bench outside the conference room, trying not to look at the clock every few seconds. His 6-year-old daughter, Lily, leaned against his side, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit she carried everywhere. She looked tired after spending most of the morning with him, but she didn't complain. She simply sat close to her father, trusting him the way children do when they believe their parent can handle anything. Normally, Daniel would have arranged childcare before coming to the office, but life had not been normal lately. 3 weeks earlier, his ex-wife had accepted a job in another state, and since then, he had been balancing parenthood and leadership responsibilities alone. It wasn't easy, but he never allowed his personal challenges to become excuses. He still arrived before most employees and often left long after everyone else had gone home. What made the situation unusual was that this wasn't just any office. Daniel owned the company. 10 years earlier, he had started the business from a small rented room with 2 second-hand desks and a laptop that constantly overheated. There had been months when he wasn't sure he could make payroll. He had worked weekends, skipped vacations, and poured everything he had into building the company. Over time, the business grew into a respected consulting firm with dozens of employees and clients across the country. Most employees knew Daniel as a fair and approachable leader. He rarely reminded people that he was the owner. He preferred listening over giving speeches and believed respect should be earned, not demanded. That morning, he had brought Lily to the office because an important executive meeting couldn't be postponed. Before arriving, he emailed the leadership team explaining the situation. He apologized for any inconvenience and asked whether it would be acceptable for Lily to quietly sit in the conference room with her coloring books during the meeting. No one objected. In fact, several managers replied with supportive messages. "Of course. No problem at all. Family comes first." Their responses reassured him. But when Daniel arrived at headquarters, something felt different. Employees in the hallway exchanged strange glances. Conversations stopped when he walked by. A few executives avoided eye contact entirely. At first, he assumed he was imagining things. Stress had a way of making people overthink small details. Then one of the senior managers stepped out of the conference room, closed the door behind him, and looked directly at Daniel. The expression on the man's face immediately told him something was wrong. The senior manager cleared his throat before speaking. "Daniel, could I talk to you for a moment?" Something in his voice immediately caught Daniel's attention. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the discomfort behind them. The man looked like someone carrying a message he didn't want to deliver. Daniel stood up slowly. "Sure." Lily remained on the bench, quietly turning the pages of a coloring book she had brought from home. The manager glanced toward her and lowered his voice. "Some members of the executive team have concerns about having a child in the meeting." Daniel frowned slightly. "Concerns?" "They feel the board discussion should remain professional." For a moment, Daniel wasn't sure he had heard correctly. "Lily isn't participating in the meeting," he said calmly. "She'll sit quietly in the corner." "I understand. Then what's the issue?" The manager hesitated. "Some people think it could create the wrong impression." Daniel looked through the glass wall into the conference room. Around the large table sat executives he had personally hired over the years. Several avoided looking in his direction, even though they clearly knew he was standing there. A strange feeling settled in his chest. Not anger, disappointment. He remembered the promises many of those same people had made during interviews. They talked about supporting families. They talked about empathy. They talked about modern workplace values. Yet a 6-year-old girl sitting quietly with crayons somehow threatened their idea of professionalism. Daniel took a slow breath. "Who specifically has a problem with it?" The manager shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't just one person. That answer told Daniel everything. Nobody wanted responsibility, but several people had participated. Before he could respond, the conference room door opened. One of the executives stepped outside. "We're ready to begin," the executive said. Then his eyes moved toward Lily. His expression tightened. "Actually," he added, "it would be best if your daughter waited somewhere else." The hallway suddenly felt very quiet. Daniel noticed Lily looking up from her coloring book. She wasn't speaking, But children are often better observers than adults realize. She could sense the tension. She could tell she wasn't welcome. The executive continued speaking as though discussing a minor scheduling issue. "We just think the meeting room isn't the right environment." Daniel stared at him for several seconds. Not because he was shocked, because he was realizing that the problem was much bigger than a meeting. It was revealing exactly what kind of people were sitting around that table. Daniel looked at his daughter for a moment before turning back to the executives. Lily had lowered her eyes to the coloring book in her lap, pretending not to listen. But he knew her well enough to recognize what was happening. She was trying to make herself smaller, quieter, less noticeable. It was the same reaction many children have when they feel unwanted. That realization bothered him more than anything the executives had said. He crouched beside her. "Hey, sweetheart," he said softly. She looked up. "Did I do something wrong?" The question hit him harder than he expected. "No," Daniel replied immediately. "Not at all." "Then why don't they want me in there?" For a second, he struggled to find the right words. Because the truth wasn't something a 6-year-old should have to hear. "It's not about you," he said. "Sometimes adults make decisions that don't reflect their best selves." Lily nodded, though he wasn't sure she fully understood. Daniel stood and walked toward the conference room. This time, he didn't stop at the doorway. He stepped inside. The conversations around the table faded. A few executives straightened in their chairs. Others suddenly became very interested in their laptops. Daniel remained standing. "I want to make sure I understand the situation correctly," he said calmly. Nobody answered. "You were informed in advance that my daughter would be here." Several people nodded. "And nobody raised objections until she arrived." Silence. The room felt noticeably uncomfortable. One executive finally spoke. "It's not personal, Daniel. We're simply trying to maintain a professional atmosphere." Daniel studied him carefully. "Professional?" "Yes. What exactly has Lily done that is unprofessional?" The executive opened his mouth but couldn't immediately answer. Because there wasn't an answer. She hadn't interrupted anyone. She hadn't touched company property. She hadn't made noise. She had simply existed in a space some people believed belonged exclusively to adults. Daniel looked around the table. Many of these leaders supervised teams of parents. Some regularly spoke about company culture. Others proudly described themselves as mentors, yet none of them had challenged what was happening. That silence concerned him even more than the original comments. A healthy workplace wasn't measured by what people said when circumstances were easy. It was measured by what they did when kindness required courage. And at that moment, Daniel realized the leadership culture he thought he had built existed mostly in presentations, mission statements, and speeches, not in practice. Daniel didn't raise his voice. In fact, that was what made the room so uncomfortable. He walked to the head of the table and placed both hands lightly on the back of a chair. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The executives seemed to be waiting for an emotional reaction, an argument, or a lecture. Instead, Daniel asked a simple question. If one of your employees had to bring their child to work because childcare fell through, how would you expect them to be treated? A few people shifted in their seats. Nobody answered. Daniel continued. Would you want them welcomed? Or would you want them made to feel like they were causing a problem? The silence grew heavier. Everyone in the room knew the answer. For years, the company had promoted values like respect, trust, and support. Those words appeared on the website, in recruitment materials, and in leadership presentations. But values only matter when they're tested. Today, they had been tested. And many people at that table had failed. Daniel glanced through the glass wall at Lily. She was still sitting quietly on the bench, coloring with complete concentration. She had no idea that the adults discussing professionalism had spent the last 20 minutes treating a well-behaved child as an inconvenience. I started this company because I wanted to build a workplace where people didn't have to choose between being good employees and being good parents, Daniel said. Several executives lowered their eyes. But what I've seen today tells me we've drifted away from that. One manager finally spoke. Daniel, I think this is being blown out of proportion. Daniel looked directly at him. No. What's being blown out of proportion is the presence of a 6-year-old with a coloring book. Nobody responded. The meeting never took place. Instead, Daniel spent the next several weeks conducting a thorough review of the leadership team. He spoke with employees across different departments and listened to concerns that had gone unaddressed for years. What he discovered surprised him. The incident involving Lily wasn't isolated. There were repeated complaints about dismissive behavior, favoritism, and leaders who preached company values while ignoring them in practice. By the end of the review, multiple senior executives were removed from their positions, not because they objected to one child sitting in a meeting room, but because their actions revealed a deeper problem. They lacked the judgment, empathy, and leadership the company required. Months later, the culture began to change. And whenever people asked Daniel what prompted the transformation, he thought back to a little girl with a stuffed rabbit and a coloring book. Sometimes the smallest moments reveal the biggest truths about an organization.